It's a pleasure being here today. I'm going to try to give you an interesting story. Of course, it may not be quite as interesting as some of the stories you guys have. Thank you all for your service and welcome home. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about the Coast Guard. Now, most people think that the Coast Guard was not in Vietnam. Even when I started up at the museum where I'm a docent up in Homedale, I was told that I was an urban legend, that it was only rumors that the Coast Guard was in Vietnam. I can't say I blame anybody for that, because throughout the conflict, there were only 8,000 Coast Guard that served in country. So over 10 years, that's only 800 a year. But we did have casualties. We had 7 KIAs. We had a number that were wounded. We had helicopter pilots, one that was a KIA up in the Ia Drang Valley. We also had crew members that were casualties, part of Squadron 1. Coast Guard had 2 squadrons there starting in around 1965-66. Squadron 1 were the 82-footers, and they worked alongside the PBRs, the Swift boats, the monitors, the Mike boats, and so on. Squadron 3, on the other hand, were the ships that I was on. I was on a 378-foot cutter. It was brand spanking new at the time. Matter of fact, I was the first, what they call striker, to leave the deck force and become an operations person. And we were there in 1970. There were 3 other ships at the time, so the squadron consisted of 4 ships. And we spent most of our time, I spent most of my time, down in 4 Corps, down around the southern part of Vietnam. And that was on the Gulf of Siam and the South China Sea. Although we did go all the way up to Hainan Tao Island. Matter of fact, I almost got in a scuffle with a patrol boat up there off of Hainan Tao Island, which is up in the Gulf of Tonkin. We were also up at Da Nang, and we supported operations at My Lai 2, which is just to the south of Da Nang. So we had a lot of interesting things going on in 1970. And for those of you that were there, that was also the time of the Cambodian incursion. And of course, that was an interesting event. But overriding that event, there was also the first mutiny in the history of the U.S. Navy. A cargo ship that was chartered by the U.S. Navy carrying bombs to Utapao, Thailand, was hijacked by 2 mutineers. They held the captain at gunpoint, and they also put 17 crew members over the side. And then they took the ship and took it into Cambodian waters. At the exact same time that Nordam Sihanouk was being overthrown by Lon Nol. So when I say it was an interesting time, none of us knew what the hell was going on. Now, for me, I was 19, 20 years old. I was a quartermaster striker, and that means navigation and communications. But I was also part of what was known as a boarding party. We had 2 boarding parties. We had a port and starboard boarding party. And we had orders to go in. We got from ComFISEC, which was Admiral Zumwalt, but it was actually countermanded within 20 minutes by Admiral McCain, Senator John McCain's father, who was the commander of the 7th Fleet at the time. And we had orders to go in. We were just pulling up our hook, and we were about 2 miles away from where the Columbia Eagle was. And we were going to be boarding it. So there were 14 of us that were part of the boarding teams. And at the same time, the mutineers who were holding the captain at gunpoint were threatening to blow the ship up, carrying all those bombs, including napalm, as well as 500-pounders that were going over for the B-52s that were doing the arc light raids during the Cambodian incursion. So those are a couple of the highlights of my time there. But I'm going to back up a little bit, especially in light of being here in Cape May County. I went through the Coast Guard Training Center here at Cape May. At the time, we had 2 training centers. We had Cape May. We also had another one in California. That one has since closed down, so now all training for the Coast Guard goes through Cape May. Anyway, I made the mistake, the first major mistake I made going into the service. I joined in February. Okay, now, those of you that live down here know that you don't have a lot of tourists going down to the beach in February. Fair statement? Well, try getting up at 4:30 in the morning, going out and doing calisthenics and personal drill under arms, at that time, in the middle of the winter, okay? It was miserable, everybody got sick, and we figured if we could survive boot camp down here in Cape May, we can survive anything the enemy could ever throw at us. And now, to be perfectly honest with you, after I got out of the service, anybody said, hey, let's go down to Cape May during the nice summer day or something, I laughed at them and said, you couldn't drag me down there. I said there were too many memories that were other than fun. We'll put it that way. But after 10 years, I finally did going back, and I'm glad because I love it down here now. As long as I can put that winter of discontent out of my mind for a little bit. So Cape May holds a lot of memories for me. And of course, when I joined the Coast Guard, now first of all, in 1969, this was after the Tet Offensive, and as you all know, back home, Vietnam was no longer a popular conflict. It had lost whatever luster it had at that time, and the protests and the divisions. We think divisions are bad now. They were pretty bad back then too. Families and friends were separated by their stance on whether to support the war or not support the war. Unfortunately, as you all know, it was the warrior that bore the brunt of all the animosity. Nobody knew who to blame for the Vietnam conflict, okay? And there was more than enough blame to go around. There was also a lot of misconceptions about why we were there. They never articulated it very well. And second of all, if you stop and think about it, it was never a declared war anyway. The last declared war we had was World War II. Now, that doesn't sound like much because for us, all intents and purposes, it was a war to end all wars. The killing, the bombs, and everything else like that. It was a war. Unfortunately for the people back home, it was not. It was television entertainment on the 6 o'clock news. And that's the unfortunate thing. That's where the division, in my mind's eye, came from. Well, anyway, so 1969 comes. My draft number was coming up. I dropped out of college, and so I lost my 2S and I was 1A. I didn't worry too much about it, though, because I still had an ace in the hole if I wanted to play it. I was a member of one of the 4 peace churches, so requesting conscientious objector status was definitely something that I could have done. But I also figured, you don't know what the hell is going on. You have to learn by doing. You have to understand by seeing, tasting, touching. And so consequently, because life is experiential, I decided I was going to take my chance and provide service to my country. I still believed in what John Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I took it very, very seriously. But I didn't want to kill anybody, and I didn't want to get killed. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I'm going to lay it all out. So I went to the Air Force, I went to the Army, I went to the Navy, and I finally ended up going to the Coast Guard. And I remember to this day the promises my recruiter made to me. Boy, what a nice guy he was. I said, well, I don't think I really want to go to Vietnam. And he said, oh, don't worry about that. He said, only 1 in 10 get to go to Vietnam, and you have to volunteer. Now, the first thing I learned from my father, who was in the Navy, you never volunteer, okay? First thing, cardinal rule number 1. So anyway, I said, well, that seems safe enough. I said, if I don't volunteer for it, maybe I'll get some duty, life station duty, something like that. Well, anyway, I joined as soon as I came out of boot camp, or 2 weeks before I graduated from boot camp. The company clerk came in and said, okay, half of the company is going to go to Hawaii, the other half is going to go to Alaska. Now here I am, I'm finishing up winter in Cape May. Do I want to go to a place like Hawaii with all the girls on the beaches and the warm weather? Or do I want to go to Alaska where I can go back and have year-round cold weather? It was an easy solution. So I raised my hand, cardinal rule number 1, I just broke. I volunteered for Hawaii. Then I thought about it. I said, well, yeah, maybe that wasn't the brightest thing to do, because it is a little closer to Vietnam. So I said, take my name off, put me on Alaska. He said, nope, too late, it's gone forward. So, you know, no action goes without a result, okay? So I reported to Hawaii, the 12th district in Honolulu, and I was there for about 2 weeks and finally got orders to go on board my ship, the Mellon, Coast Guard cutter Mellon. And so here I am, I'm now on board the cutter. I'm getting ready to go on my first Ocean Station Victor patrol. And all of a sudden we got orders. We said, when we come back from Ocean Station Victor, which is halfway between Japan and Hawaii, we were going to go to underway training at Pearl Harbor. And at the end of underway training, we were going to deploy. We had a deployment on Westpac, and that was Vietnam. So here I am, because I already volunteered, and here I am on my way to Vietnam. 1 in 10 that volunteer, right? The numbers are working out pretty well. Not so much in my favor, but they were working. So anyway, we go through the first Ocean Station Victor. Now the interesting part of that, I'll show you some slides in a little bit. Am I boring anybody yet? Just throw a tomato or a piece of fruit or something like that. I'll change my tack. Anyway, so my first Ocean Station Victor patrol was July and August of 1969. Now what happened in July of 1969? Historically speaking, one of the most important times in Earth history.
Martin Luther King.
No, he was 68. No, 1969, we landed men on the moon, Apollo 11. And Apollo 11 set down a couple hundred miles to the south of where I was on Ocean Station Victor. But here's where it gets kind of interesting. I love telling these stories. Probably all you're going to think I'm a UFO nut, and maybe I am in a way. But we had a very interesting experience during the Apollo 11 mission. We had 3 objects that were picked up on our air search radar, flying towards the ship, coming out of the northeast, heading on a southwesterly course that would take them directly over my ship. And they were clocked at 3,500 miles per hour, and they were flying in tight formation. Now, in 1969, I don't know too many of our aircraft could fly at 3,500 miles per hour and fly in tight formation with 2 other aircraft. And sure enough, we picked them up. There were 15 of us on the bridge at the time. And we go running out to the starboard bridge wing, the right bridge wing, because that was the direction that the objects were coming from. So we're all out there, including my ship's captain, who was a senior 06 in the Coast Guard. He would never make admiral because he was not an academy man. He was a Mustanger, E1 all the way up to 06. But he was a master mariner too. And the guy had spent already 30 years before the mast. So we're all out there and we pick up these objects on the horizon, 3 bright points of light. They flew directly over the ship. We went running through the bridge out onto the port bridge wing or the left bridge wing, and we watched them disappear in the southwest. It took about 6 seconds. So we had them on radar. They were clocked on radar, and our navigators were sitting there with their slide rules. Remember, we didn't have computers back in those days. This is 1969, and they were working it out with the slide rule, and they corroborated the speed of about being 3,200 miles per hour. Now, the one thing that you have to do, there are instructions that the Navy put out and the Air Force, or joint operations actually, and that you had to report anything of a national security nature. It would be encrypted and transmitted through the ship's radio to points wherever. And sure enough, the radio officer came up, took the report, and sent it off. Now, you never hear anything about it again. That's the way it works. So we had that event. We also then we came back and we had underway. Now, for underway training, we had to do something. We had to recalibrate our ship's compass. We have a gyro compass. And we used magnetic compass and we did the calibration. And the way you do the calibration is actually pretty simple. Sit on the helm, somebody sitting on the helm steering the ship, and somebody yells out a cardinal point to the compass. So there's 8 cardinal points. And you steady on the course, and when you're on the course, as a helmsman, you're supposed to yell, mark, mark, mark. And as long as you're on that course, you continue to yell mark until they tell you to stop. So anyway, I was the helmsman. Now I'm just a seaman apprentice. And I'm sitting on the helm. They gave me a course to steer. I'm looking at our gyro compass. I'm steering the course, yelling mark, mark, mark. Now the one thing I was very, very good at, it just came naturally to me, is keeping a ship directly on course by making micro changes to the helm. Okay? You have to take into consideration the sea conditions, wind conditions, all these conditions. And as long as I could keep it directly on that mark, I'm yelling mark, mark, mark. So after this went on for about 10 or 15 marks, the captain comes out of the captain's chair, comes and stands behind me, thinking I'm doing something wrong, that I couldn't possibly be keeping on. So I did the rest of the eight points of the compass, same thing. No matter what course we were on, I was able to keep it dead on the course. So the captain goes to the chief quartermaster and said, I want him as a quartermaster. He's going to be my GQ helmsman. Of course, that's general quarters for combat operations. So that got me off the deck force. Nobody knows how much I hated painting, chipping and painting. Okay. If you've done any chipping and painting, you know what a miserable job it is. And I would do anything to get out of it. So I did this, and that got me out. So when we went to Vietnam, my job was just as a quartermaster. I kept the logs, I did visual communications, and I did navigation. So it worked out for me. And fortunately for me, my life has kind of followed that trajectory all the way along. After making a couple of bad decisions, or what I thought at the time were bad decisions, they turned out to be excellent choices. So everything worked out. Basically, I'm showing you two Coast Guard cutters here. The Coast Guard cutter on the left is my ship, the Mellon. 378 foot, powered by twin turbine engines, 707 jet engines. It has a bow thruster. It was state-of-the-art, except for its weapons. The weapons were all hand-me-down Navy from World War II. The cutter on the right is an 82-footer. Now in Vietnam, we had two squadrons. We had Squadron 1, which I mentioned before. The 82-footers were Squadron 1. We were all part of Operation Market Time. Market Time was to stem the flow of men and material into South Vietnam. And we were to do that by inspecting junks and sampans. We sank several SL-4 infiltration trawlers. And the 82-footers provided those services up the rivers and estuaries, along with Navy PBRs, swift boats, and so on. And the 378s were offshore. We were the brown water. We stayed probably within a mile of the coast. We were the main support ship for a Navy SEAL base at the mouth of the Sanondak River, which is located on the Gulf of Siam. Okay, this was my company, Kilo Company, where the red arrow is. That was me, a skinny little kid. I was 130 pounds soaking wet. Okay, and again, that's Squadron 1. Okay, and Squadron 2 I mentioned. Okay, now also the Coast Guard in Vietnam, we had the two squadrons. That was the main bulk of the personnel that were in Vietnam. We were either Squadron 1 or Squadron 2. But the Coast Guard also took over ammunition handling duties at the ports because there were a number of serious accidents. And one thing the Coast Guard does pretty well is handle hazardous materials in port situations. So they did that. But we also supplied a number of Coast Guard helicopter pilots. And the reason the Coast Guard helicopter pilots were kind of in demand in a bit is because they spent most of their time training on search and rescue missions. And of course in Vietnam, especially toward the end, with the widespread use of air power, there were a lot of pilots that had to eject, planes were going down, and there were a lot of rescue missions, both over land as well as in the sea. So that's where they earned their keep. The Coast Guard had 7 KIAs, one of which was a helicopter pilot who was shot down in the Ia Drang Valley. Of course, that's near Hamburger Hill and also the I Drang, where we were soldiers and young, took place. Okay, and again, that was part of Squadron 3. I mentioned earlier our involvement in the Cambodian incursion. We were an afterthought. Now, the Coast Guard is not really thought of in major tactical terms, or at least we didn't think it was. But by proximity to an event that took place, we happened to become the station ship for the Columbia Eagle incident. And the Columbia Eagle, of course, was a U.S. cargo ship. It was a Liberty ship from World War II, but it was on charter to the U.S. Navy carrying ammunition, aerial bombs for the B-52s, as well as napalm for the tactical fighters. So that ship was held at gunpoint by 2 mutineers. It was taken into Cambodian waters. During the Lon Nol coup d'etat against Nordum Sihanouk, also we had troops getting ready to fight a major battle along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia. But it came out in the New York Times and became a major political liability. So our orders to go in and arrest the mutineers were put on the back burner, and they were also ordered all U.S. military personnel out of Cambodia. We had, I think it was 35,000 men in Cambodia at the time, getting ready to fight a major battle against the North Vietnamese and the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And we got awards for that activity. This is the Columbia Eagle right here. Okay, it was a Liberty ship. Okay, and the station ship. Now here, my ship is the ship on the right, or to the right of the Navy ship, and the Jarvis, my sister ship, was to the other side. We were unrepping with it. We did a lot of unrep in Vietnam. Anecdotally, my father was in the Navy in World War II, and he was on board an attack transport called the Virgo. The Virgo was also the last of the World War II Navy ships that were still active Navy craft. In Vietnam, it was no longer an attack cargo, it was an ammunition ship. And we took on an ammunition load from the Virgo, so I actually unrepped with my father's old ship. Now, my father's old ship also was, there were 2 ships that became the movie Mr. Roberts. You've all seen the movie Mr. Roberts, right? Well, that was an amalgamation of 2 ships, the Virgo being one of them, and the other one was another ship that the Lieutenant J.G., who wrote the book, was on both of those ships, and he combined the 2 stories into Mr. Roberts. The marbles in the overhead, that was on my dad's ship, as well as the palm tree that was thrown overboard, the captain's palm tree that was thrown overboard. That was my dad's ship as well. So that's a little bit. Also, I got a tattoo, a $2 tattoo. I got it in the same place my dad got his tattoo in World War II on Hotel Street in Honolulu. Anyway, some of the ports of call that we made, I made it to Bangkok, or Krung Thep, better known as Krung Thep. Also Singapore. I fell in love with Singapore. Anybody here ever been to Singapore for R&R? No. Singapore was an interesting city. It was very clean back then. It was still a British colony. They got their freedom, if you will, a short time thereafter. We did have an interesting thing. I'll hold off on this. We had an interesting event. Again, I mentioned that our job was interdiction. Okay, the bad guys would be dropping off pallets of supplies, ammunition, food, whatever. They'd also be dropping off men, okay? And they would jump out. They would usually try to stay outside of the territorial waters, again, because we couldn't do anything. And there was one Chi-Com freighter, and these guys were going faster than we were able to go. I was shocked. We could do 28 knots. These guys were doing about 32 knots. So we couldn't catch them even, which is an embarrassment if you ask me. But the thing was, they were throwing these gigantic pallets over the side. They're going 32 knots and throwing these pallets over the side. And they're big. They were probably about like this, okay? They were not small. And they were loaded with boxes, ammunition, whatever. And so all we could do is, because we couldn't catch, well, we couldn't do anything if we could catch them, because they were outside the territorial waters. But the area was totally surrounded by everything from basket boats. Ever see a basket boat? I mean, you can go, these people, South Vietnam, they would go fishing miles offshore in a boat that's about this big, made out of wicker, a wicker basket, right? So here they are, 25 miles out to sea in these little basket boats. And anyway, there were 400 or 500 sampans, junks, basket boats, and some of these were actually the bad guys, and they were going out and they were taking the supplies, and then they would sneak them ashore. All we could do was set up a couple of our 50 caliber machine guns and blast the heck out of these pallets. All you could do is to try to destroy what you couldn't capture and take. So this is what we were seeing, and it was happening all the time. Now the area where we were, I mentioned seeing a duffel bag. This is the first place I saw what they call a duffel bag sensor. That's that little jobby over there. And that duffel bag was amazing, because every time we had a fire mission around the Navy SEAL base was always totally surrounded. They were attacked all the time, and you know, we were always providing gunfire support, but we were firing at positions that were marked by these sensors, and that's what would give us our fire control was happening. So I had never seen one until I came to this museum. Yeah, okay. And that object, you can't even find a lot of information on it to this day, which tells me that the thing was so effective, it's probably still effective and still has applicability during some type of conflicts. It was used in the jungles in Vietnam, obviously. But the sniffers, the way they were designed, from what I read about them, they would pick up seismic activity. So when somebody's running through an area, especially after after a certain time, you could not move. You were not supposed to be in certain areas. Otherwise, it would be a free fire zone. Well, what would happen is they would pick up the sound of the footprints that would be marked on in a control barge. The SEAL base had a barge where they had the sensors were all marked out apparently, and then they would give the grid coordinates of where they needed gunfire support. Well, it had something else. Some of the other things it was able to do, they were able to sniff out ammonia. And of course, ammonia, when a human being sweats, you sweat ammonia. It can identify smells, whether they're human smells or something else. That's how sensitive, even back in the 60s, the technology was. So when I see one of these things, it's, yep, I'm in awe, because we spent so much time shooting at where they were telling us to shoot. How many people have ever seen one of these or used one? Okay.
They use them for elephant grass. For elephant grass, you see it, they see they were in there.
Right. Okay. Okay. Well, they were seismic sensors only,
Yeah,
right?
Well, chop them helicopter, way up, and then right in the grass. You don't know if they're there or not.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, it's amazing technology. Some of the things that came out of Vietnam, I'm not sure to this day how we lost, because some of the technology was just amazing. You know, it's it speaks for itself actually. What I like, I believe this was actually developed at Fort Monmouth, the U.S. Army Communications Electronics Command. That is a puzzle palace. If you ever have a chance, I also operate a radio telescope up at Camp Evans. Camp Evans was also part of, I'm digressing now. Camp Evans was also part of the Manhattan Project, and that is where the fuse mechanism, the radar fuse mechanisms, proximity fuses, were invented and developed and used on the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, and also some of the spy stuff that went on. There were 56 German scientists and engineers that worked there. There was so much history here in New Jersey, especially when it goes to military.
Is that the hexagon?
The hexagon was part of it. No, this is Camp Evans, which is in Wall Township, Belmar section. Matter of fact, I operate an 18-meter. It was a space radar. The Army used it for space radar. They still own the antenna, but now we use it as a radio telescope. We bounced. Oh, that's the other thing. The first signal that was bounced off of the moon took place from Camp Evans, January 10th, 1946. And that was the birth of the space age. It was not down at Cape Canaveral. It was not down at White Sands, New Mexico. It was at Fort Monmouth. Okay. Anyway, I'm sorry about the digression. Okay, right here, I've been rambling actually. Any questions, any comments?
Can you explain this a little bit more again? I would really like to know a little bit more about that. So
Well, actually, I should defer to this gentleman over here.
they dropped it from
They
the.
have a special rope they put on it. The helicopter's about 100 feet.
So they dropped it with the rope to go
Go
right into the
some-
ground.
Some elephant grass is 20 feet tall.
Oh.
And it cuts us. Even when they don't cut you.
Yeah.
Well, the VC don't get cut, you know, and they hide in there, and that's how we know they're in there, you know.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Like I said, it's amazing. There's other amazing. You also have a Prick 25 over there. Of course, the Prick 25 was the core radio for the ground troops. And of course, if you wore that on your back, you were target number one. Yeah, they probably went after you.
Or the 10s wouldn't kind of, they're looking to shoot you.
Yeah, yep. Ever see, there was a picture, it had 9 guys with radios with the biggest antennas you've ever seen, all standing together. So yeah, you have that. Also, well, we all probably use night vision scopes too. Okay, now those night vision scopes, I mean, there's interesting stories that I won't tell here, but also the night vision scopes were invented by Fort Monmouth and the Communications and Electronics Command. Night vision laboratories down in Fort Belvoir. So, and we had 2 of them on my ship, and the barrels were this wide. We had 1 on each bridge wing. And of course, when you look through them, it makes nighttime into daylight. I think everything is green. It's got a greenish glow to it. But own the night is what the U.S. military aimed for. And if you can see the enemy and the enemy can't see you, you own the night. But the amazing thing about it, you could be looking through this, and we were maybe a quarter mile offshore, and we'd watch the Hueys coming in on the gunships, and they'd be going in, and next thing you know, they turned on their miniguns, okay, the little Gatling guns. And when you're watching through the night vision scope, all you're seeing is every 5th round, right? And it's like somebody turned a garden hose on as it's arcing down into the jungle. And you have the whole thing is lit up, and it looks like a stream of water, but you're only seeing every 5th or 6th round. So, those miniguns were something. Yes?
So, what was on the ship that could pick up the signal from there? What was on the ship that picked up the signal from that object?
Oh, from this thing? It wasn't on the ship. Well, the way the action worked, there would be forward observers, or there would also be a command center. The Navy, that SEAL base, they had a command center, and the command center apparently, I never saw it myself, but I believe it had panels of lights, and they corresponded with where these things were dropped. And each one was a grid coordinate on a military map, right, the tactical map. And what they would do, they would call in the grid coordinates that they wanted us to fire our 5-inch 38 caliber main gun. And we were firing, at the time, anti-aircraft common as well as white phosphorus. So depending on what they called for, if there was a large concentration and they knew that they were out there, they saw them or whatever, they would call that in, or they would call something else in. Illumination, we could even use illumination. When I first got there, when we first got to that station, we dropped our hook, and before the hook had actually taken hold in the water, a helicopter, Army helicopter, comes racing out to the ship. And we had just finished Navy underway training. So everything we were doing was by the book, right? Because that's what they were scoring us on. So we had our poor LSO out there, our landing safety officer, and he had his yellow helmet on, he had his wagging mechanisms, and he's standing there on the flight deck, and the Army helicopter pilot's coming in, so he's doing this. And the guy almost ran him over. He was coming in on a combat mission. and you didn't mess with those guys. They didn't need an LSO. And the reason he was flying like a bat out of hell, he had a wounded SEAL on board. It was a dust-off, medevac. And by the time they got him out onto the deck, he expired on our deck. And it was welcome to Vietnam. You know, the poor guy was wounded in the attack. And then, of course, our main thing, we were on station except when relieved. So we'd be sitting there and we'd be boarding sampans. We'd been doing all this stuff during the day. And at night, you had to be prepared because the enemy would operate at night. So they would either attack the SEAL base or they could even attack us. There were sappers in the water. And so we, and everybody, the rule of engagement was after 8 o'clock, all sampans and junks and anything on the water had to stop and stay in place. They had to anchor in place. And of course, we had them marked on our surface search radar, and we also had our deck sentries, And every once in a while, you would pick up one of these boats trying to inch in closer to you. And it happened all the time. And all we did, we had this gigantic automated floodlight, a big gigantic spotlight. So we would turn it on and put the spotlight right on the offending boat. All of a sudden, they stopped. They wouldn't move after that. As soon as they knew that you were watching, everything kind of went back to safe conditions. We got relieved one time, and we had to go to Subic Bay. And when we were in Subic Bay, we were relieved by a Navy LST, one of the rocket launching LSTs. They put up thousands of rockets in one firing. Well, apparently the sappers got to them, and they set a bomb off underneath the hull, and they went down in shallow water. So that's the reason you had to really be very careful, because everybody was a target. They could take a pot shot if you're within a quarter mile, a half mile. A 308 round could hit the ship without any problem at all. We were lucky. The skipper in 1970, I think I can safely say that nobody wanted to be the last casualty in Vietnam, because by 1970 everything was being turned over, and we were just trying to figure out how to get out of there without our tail being between our legs. So, and our skipper felt the same way. He did not want to lose anybody needlessly. So, a lot of the things that, doubled down on security on the ship, making sure everybody was doing what they were supposed to be doing. And he didn't volunteer for any, extraordinary missions that, would have been maybe a little foolhardy in the scheme of things. Yes.
Were you part of helping with the evacuation?
No. We were relieved early because of the Vietnamization. And one of our cutters actually was out on Ocean Station Victor, and it was one of our World War II cutters, and they were over the side using the chipping hammer and painting the ship at sea. And one guy went through the hull. He made a hole through the hull with his chipping hammer. So I figured we might want to get these guys back to a safe port, because the ship was no longer safe. It was, and that left us short-handed, because Ocean Station Victor was purely Coast Guard operation. Navy turned it over to the Coast Guard in like the late 50s. So we had been maintaining Ocean Station. And on Ocean Station, we always had aerographers and marine scientists. And we were always taking bathyothermic readings for sonar. We were taking aerological meetings for, the aircraft that were traversing the ocean and all. And we had NOAA people on board. So that was our function. Then after a while, that function became less important, because now we had satellites to do a lot of that. And we had a lot of deep sea buoys that were gathering information as well. So they did away with Ocean Station vessels in the mid to late 70s. So now it was strictly, the other things that they've been doing ever since. Interdiction, drug interdiction, military operations. The Coast Guard has taken on more military operations, even though we were under the Department of Transportation at the time. In times of war, though, we change of operations to the Navy, and it's always been that way. So we're still doing that, but now my ship was also the first ship to fire a anti-ship missile. which is kind of funny because my ship, we'd fire a 5-inch 38 caliber gun, and the whole thing would shake so violently it would fall apart on us. You got hit in the head from things coming from the overhead. So, but anyway,
The Coast Guard uniforms over there. The blue, they say that there's blue ones and there's white ones. So what would you, is the blue one a dress one and the white one you would wear on the ship?
well, you actually had two types of dress white uniforms. You had a short sleeve white with that button, with the collar things. You also had a jumper with a white jumper, which is similar to the blue one. And the jumper is, that's part of the traditional sailor's uniform. But that was white, and that would have been your dress white jumper. And you wore a black neckerchief with it. And of course the blue, your dress blues, those were your winter uniforms or travel uniforms, because a lot of times when we went to Hong Kong, we would have gabardines made, which fit better, and you felt sexier, The wool stuff that they give you, it found its way to the bottom of your sea bag, and that's where it stayed. It was too warm, it was too itchy, it was typical wool. So you had those type of uniforms. Now they also, like I said, you had the short sleeve, white pants. Okay, the white trousers would have gone with the white jumper, or with the white shirt. We also had the Donald Duck hat was our dress hat. Okay, but we also wore the Dixie cup, so we looked like we were in the Navy. The only difference between a Coast Guard uniform and a Navy uniform is we had a shield on our sleeve, and the Navy had a star on their sleeve. But other than that, our ratings, like I was a quartermaster in the Coast Guard, but in the Navy, there were two separate, what we did were two separate ratings. One was signalman, the other was quartermaster. Okay, so the Coast Guard combined theirs because they're cheap. Okay, they got two for the price of one. And but then even that, in the 1970s, 1980s, they reorged the Coast Guard and they got rid of quartermasters. Now the quartermaster, who is also a signalman, is now a bosun's mate. Okay, so that's how it changes over time. When I went into the Coast Guard, they were always berating us, telling us, "You guys are soft. You're not like the old guard." Okay, and the old guard said, "Oh my God, these guys must walk on water or something." And they were tough. The old saying was, it was days of iron men and wooden ships. Okay, well, the funny thing now, after what the changes that the Coast Guard has gone through ever since, let me give you an example. My cycle, which was February through April, we lost four recruits. Okay, one was drowned by a swimming instructor. One was cranked to death because he was caught smoking a cigarette in the head. Okay, they dragged him out of the head, got him out onto the quarterdeck, which is where 4 bays all came together on that floor, and then made him crank off doing push-ups with a full pack of cigarettes lighted in his mouth. Marlboros, I remember to this day, it was all Marlboros, and we had to go out there and watch him crank these things off. Well, the poor guy had a circulatory collapse. And to top it off, this is also the time they ended up at Fort Dix, they had cases of spinal meningitis. And we also had something at Cape May, and I guarantee they still have it. It's called the Cape May crud, okay, which is upper respiratory infection. URI is what they called it. But when you got sick with that and you started going out every morning out to the quad doing your calisthenics or PUTA, you got pneumonia, okay? Yeah, they didn't fool around. Well, anyway, my company had 70% casualties with the crud. I was laid up in there. And the problem was, if you were there 3 days or more, you got recycled the whole week. And it was going to be over my dead body that I was going to spend another week in Cape May. So, but what happened was, interestingly, the sick bay was totally filled to the rafters. They even had to put racks down the middle of the aisle, the walking aisle. And the guy that was cranking off the push-ups that had to smoke the whole pack, he was in an oxygen tent. And there were only 8 women in the Coast Guard at the time. One of them was a Corps woman at Cape May, very attractive young lady, red hair, but she was as mean as the day was long. She came in along with the male corpsman. They came up to the poor guy in the oxygen tent, and they started kicking his rack, right? And they told him to get out and start cranking him off. They called him a malingerer. He died on the spot right there. That was a true story. Another one dove out of a third floor window of the barracks. He died. The fourth one died, got up one morning, marched down to the quadrangle, past the quadrangle, and into the ocean. His body showed up in, not Cape May, Wildwood, 2 months later. So there was all types of congressional inquiries. My drill instructors, at least half of my drill instructors were prior service Marines. The guy that was drowned by the swimming instructor, in order to get out of boot camp, you had to do 2 hours of drown proofing. Now, drown proofing is a stroke. You don't tread water. You don't stroke, even if you could. You had to do it exactly the way you were told, because in theory, you could do this for like 48 hours and sleep and everything else. But the key was you do a dead man's float, a jellyfish float. You count so many seconds, and the whole time you're blowing out in a controlled exhaust of air. And then you do one stroke, a breaststroke, and one scissor kick. Your head comes out of the water, you take another, you don't gasp at it, you breathe normally, then go right back into a dead man's float. We had to do it for 2 hours. And if you got nervous, you started using up your oxygen. When you used your oxygen up, you started panicking and you started doing jerky motions and treading water. And then what they would do, they'd start poking you with a long pole. Get your attention. They wanted you to get back into the routine, but by this time you're burning oxygen at a high rate and you're getting more nervous because people are yelling at you. So this guy here, he couldn't get back into the rhythm. And so finally one of the instructors jumped in, and they did it to others too. They dragged him under and let his lungs fill up with water. Now meanwhile, there's 60 of us standing, well, there was a term for it, but you're very close to one another, back to front, and looking up at the overhead. And you're told, never take your eyes off the overhead, no matter what you hear. So you hear the screaming, the thrashing, you hear shouting, but you still can't move because they'll do the same thing to you. So finally that guy, they got him onto the side, they started pumping him out, and his lungs hemorrhaged. And he started bleeding all over the place. There was blood all over the place. So, I mean, and there were congressional inquiries about it. There were congressional inquiries about the guys that died at Fort Dix from the spinal meningitis too. And they changed, boot camp was changed from that cycle forward. They did not do any of that stuff. They called out a lot of the instructors supposedly and everything. But it got your attention. I'll tell you right now, it got your attention. Yeah, not necessarily in a positive way. So, anyway, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to take a downward spiral on this. Okay. Yes.
You talk about tracers. The Army had a C-130, and they cut sides of it. You know? And I think they had 10 miniguns on it. And when you see that thing, the decal on the side says, "Huff the Magic Dragon." And when he goes like that, it looks like a dragon. Yeah? And they shoot them.
Yeah.
Looks like a dragon in the air.
Very, very effective too.
Very effective.
Yeah, matter of fact, those miniguns, I think just one of those miniguns, they were able to put down 6,000 rounds a minute, and it would take 300 yards wide by, or 300 yards long by 100 yards wide, and the whole thing was just peppered with rounds.
Yeah, the C-130 carries its own ammunition. It's a cargo plane.
Yeah.
So they ran out during Tet. They loaded it 4 times. And went back up. Yeah.
You know, the ones they're using now are much more lethal. They have, I think, 105 millimeters.
Well, everything
Howitzers.
is homemade. Everything's homemade. You know?
Yeah.
Well, brackets, everything's homemade. You know?
Yeah, it's unfortunate that.
And you mentioned we had jungle rot, dysentery, malaria.
Yeah. And that's all the good stuff you had.
That's the great stuff, yeah. That's what you wanna get.
Yeah.
From the rats. Everybody
And the
told
rats.
us about about the
Oh,
rats.
When, when you guys, what do they call it, soften the area? With artillery?
Yeah.
Well, the rats come out. We're destroying their home, it's chicken.
Yeah.
And they're about that big.
Yeah.
And they're not afraid of you.
The stories that people never hear. And they don't show you the videos of it either. Any other questions or comments?
They're all heroes, nobody talks about the rats. I mean, I do.
Well, it's funny because our ship, whenever we pulled into port,
Everybody
the first
hears.
thing that went out was a rat guard.
I always say, there's a whole lot of stories in Vietnam, some of them are even real.
Yeah, that's true.
The 7 that died during the war.
I'm sorry?
The 7 Coast Guard that died during the war. Were
Right.
were they with you?
No. Actually, there's a movie out, and it's Coast Guard at War. It's a video that's on. It's been shown on a number of different channels now. That's an excellent one because one of the guys I served with was a gunner's mate, a guy named Gary Altoff. And Gary, I think he was a Silver Star winner. He came back. He was on board my ship. He was a gunner's mate on my ship, but he volunteered to come back, and he was part of the Squadron 1. He was on one of the 82-footers. And he actually saved, I think it was 11 South Vietnamese special forces. They were trapped on the beach, and he had a small rubber boat, and he came in, and they all wanted to get off because they were totally surrounded by the Viet Cong, or the North Vietnamese, and he was taking fire. They were getting some covering fire from his 82-footer, but he came, and when he first got there, they all wanted to jump on the boat, but he could only take half of them. So he said, "I'll come back," and he ended up coming back, and he ended up, I think it was a Silver Star that he won for that. But we also had an operations officer. He was a lieutenant commander. My ship was so top heavy with it was a showboat of the district. So I had a full captain as an old man, whereas most Navy ships would only have a lieutenant commander for a skipper. And we also had 2 commanders on board. One was number 2 to him. He was an interesting story. But the other guy was in operations, and this guy came on board and he had a match M1 Garand, chromed M1 Garand. He had a chrome 45, right? And when he pulled up, he always had starched khakis on. I don't know who was starching his uniform at sea, but always had starched khakis on. And he pulled up, and one of the Navy PBRs pulled up next to us. And I think there was a young ensign that was on the PBR. And so all of a sudden, this lieutenant commander goes over. He said, "Son, I want to go on a mission with you." And he had his M1 in his hand. He had his, everything super squared away. And this poor ensign, he was in dirty camos. He looked like a mess. But he was a business guy. He was doing the work he needed to be doing. So he took a look at this lieutenant commander. He said, "Sir, you're too military for this boat." And the guy didn't know what to say. But he didn't go. True story. Yeah. Yes.
I had heard that when the 82s went over, they were white. And
Yeah.
the first night out, they got shot up because they showed up in the moonlight. And the next day, they were all gray.
Yeah. My ship stayed white the entire time. I always wondered about that. I said, why can't we have a little camo? Little camouflage.
So they actually painted the boats?
Oh yeah, the 82-footers, well, they kind of compromised. They took the white and they made them gray, navy gray. So at least at night and dusk, you had a little bit of, you didn't radiate what you were out there because you were a target, And they were good boats. They were good, solid boats. They got involved in a friendly fire incident. One got shot up very badly. 2 men were killed on it. 2 Coast Guard were killed. But the thing sustained fire from F4s. Now there was another story, a guy named General Brown, who was the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He came back in the 1970s. He said, you know, there were UFOs in Vietnam. He said, we didn't call them UFOs, we called them enemy helicopters. And it was kind of like a euphemism because everybody knew the enemy was not flying helicopters in South Vietnam. I don't even think they were flying them in North Vietnam. But there were several firefights and there were casualties. One of the PCFs, which is a Navy boat, it's like a PBR, I guess. Anyway, one of the PCFs got shot up very badly. I think 4 men on that one were killed. And there were also 2 Coast Guardsmen killed on one of the 82-footers. You know, they were, and again, depending on who you talk to, it was either friendly fire or it was something else. There was also an Australian Navy guided missile frigate, and the Hobart. And the Hobart was also attacked supposedly by F4s firing AIM-7 air-to-air missiles, along with an American cruiser that got hit. And also another American destroyer got hit at the same time. But the Hobart is the one that lost 2 crew members on that attack. But to this day, there's a question. They're questioning how the F4s mistook these ships for enemy ships. They were operating around the DMZ, so because they were near the DMZ, you would err on the side of safety. But there should have been some attention paid to friendlies that were in the area. The whole thing about fratricide became a major issue, especially after Vietnam was over. There was a Colonel Harry G. Summers, Army colonel, and he wrote a book. It was called On Strategy, and it was a post-mortem of the Vietnam conflict. And he laid it out there very succinctly, very easy reading, and he pointed out the things that we did right, the things we did wrong, and if we did them wrong, we have to work on fixing these things going forward, which is a smart thing to do. I don't know how many Americans were killed by fratricide, but I'm going to guess that it was a pretty high number, you know, relatively speaking. So anyway, after the Vietnam conflict, we had the 80s, and the 80s they redid the U.S. military. They followed a lot of Harry Summers' recommendations. Matter of fact, his book to this day is still used as a training guide for the Army War College, but also the Navy War College. So he was onto something. And then they would also talk to people like Harry Moore. Of course, Harry Moore was We Were Soldiers and Young, the book, and as well as the movie that was on with Mel Gibson. Anyway, so those showed the things we were doing right and the things that we were doing wrong and what we had to rethink. So in the 90s, okay, now I'm really digressing. I was part of an advanced warfighting experiment that took place around 1997. And basically they had something called the Louisiana maneuvers. Now at the end of World War II, we had this gigantic drawdown. We had 2 or 3 million men under arms for World War II. Now we had to get it down to like 300,000 or 400,000, right? So they're doing away with units, they're doing away with material, everything was changing. But they still needed to maintain some type of military readiness because now we had the Russians as our enemies, the Soviets. So what happened was when Korea broke out, Pentagon started looking at the assets that we had available that we could send over as part of this peacekeeping mission, or UN peacekeeping mission, or police action. And they said, okay, well, we have this unit, and this unit. They're all set to go. All we have to do is do some maneuvers, war maneuvers, down to Louisiana. So what they did, they activated all these units, brought them to Louisiana, and then some bright logistician figured out, hey, we don't have any equipment for these guys. So we have 16,000 men, part of a corps or whatever, ready to go to battle in Korea. And they didn't have any guns, they didn't have any tanks, they didn't have anything. So they came up with something called the Louisiana maneuvers. And they said, well, let's never get caught flat-foot again like that. Let's make sure if we have military on paper, they can actually fight a war. So they came up with this strategy, and they looked at how many troops we had, the military table of equipment, make sure each soldier that needed a rifle had a rifle, and so on. And then they said, okay, let's look at the world situation. So the first of these maneuvers, or the post-maneuver events, took place in the mid-1950s. And they said, okay, where's the next war going to be? Well, we're looking at the French, and the French is doing everything in their power to get us involved in Vietnam. So we figured it looks like we may be fighting in the jungles. This is 1955. They said, what is going to give us the ability to fight and win in the jungles, say Vietnam? So somebody came up with a bright idea and said, we need air mobility. So we have all these cavalry units, and they're still riding horses, believe it or not. So what are we going to do with a cavalry unit? We're going to send them into Vietnam, into the jungles, riding a horse or a mule? So they said, no. Okay. So they invented the Huey. The Huey was actually designed in the mid-1950s. Then they said, okay, we got this technology. Now how do we use it? What are we going to do to make it an effective tool? So they started looking at this, and they said, okay, let's take the guys that fight on horseback, and let's train them how to use a helicopter instead of a horse. And they did that with the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old unit. Guess who was in charge of that particular brigade? Hal Moore. That's right. He was the first one to test out the strategy and the training that would be used successfully in Vietnam. So he trained at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, or I think it was Leavenworth. Then, of course, they deploy, and his first battle is against General Giap. And of course, General Giap, he's the one that kicked the butt of the French at a little place called Dien Bien Phu. Threw the French out. The French had to sue for peace after that. Well, Giap said, okay, now we have to fight against the Americans. I'm going to have to do the same thing to the Americans that I did to the French. So what happens is, Colonel Moore comes in, Ai Drang Valley. He lands in the valley. Where do the French make their last stand? In a valley, surrounded by mountains. Now, Giap's got control of the mountains all around the Ai Drang Valley. So he said, okay, this should be pretty easy. But he didn't take into consideration that he was going to be fighting not against infantry, but he's going to be fighting air mobile. Okay? They're going to come in, they're going to land at a landing zone, they're going to fight, they're going to remove their wounded and dead and, get supplied. So it was a different type of battle. And the battle actually went on for 2 weeks. Now, the first week when Hal Moore was there, basically fought, and it was considered an American victory. The second week, however, was a bloodbath. Americans got bloodied very badly on the second week. Maybe it's because Hal Moore wasn't there with his tactics. I don't know. But the thing was that Giap said in the movie, he said it's a shame. The Americans are now think they won this war, and it's going to be, now it's their war. Now it's the American war. Then he said, but it's a shame. The outcome is going to be the same. It's just that many, many more people are going to die. Okay? Now, to close out this little part of the story, Hal Moore was also not Hal Moore, Colonel Summers was also part of the negotiating team. After Nixon won, it took 2 years to finally decide on the shape of the table at the Paris Peace Accords and who was going to be sitting at the table. And during the negotiations, all the teams were there. North Vietnam was there, France was there, Americans, South Vietnam. And during the break in the action, General Giap is having a conversation with Colonel Summers. And he said, you Americans, you have figured out how to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And the Americans said, what do you mean? He said, during Tet 68, we threw everything we had at you. They snuck tanks down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They had artillery. They had 100,000 men. They invaded the entire country. The first week, they were, pardon the expression, kicking butt. It was the second week that the United States and our allies, we got our feet underneath us, and we defeated them throughout the rest of the country. It was an American victory. However, By the time the 6 o'clock news back home came on, all you saw were the pictures of dead Americans or the police chief of Saigon getting ready to blow the brains out of a guy in civilian clothes. Remember that picture?
Yeah.
Well, that picture, nobody ever knew what the backstory was. And the press, to this day, they do the same thing. They will not tell the backstory. The backstory.
He was a high-ranking guy in the Viet Cong army.
Exactly. Also, he killed the police chief's best friend, who was a tank battalion commander, and his entire family, and they caught him right after the act carrying a weapon. Now, when I get high school kids coming in and we give this talk, I always tell them, I said, if you understand the picture, what it really represents, it's horrible, don't get me wrong. I'm not justifying anybody getting their brains blown out. But the thing is that if you knew the truth, it would make a heck of a lot more sense, and you would not be so sanguine about being so angry at people. You're misplacing your anger. And basically what it was that the Geneva Convention, okay, the Geneva Convention is very simple. It's how to fight. It's the rules of engagement of a civilized war, if there can be such a thing as a civilized war. First of all combatants must be in uniform. You must be in your uniform. You cannot be in your enemy's uniform, and you cannot be fighting in civilian clothes. If you do any of those things, summary execution is authorized according to the Geneva Convention. Okay? Now, what you had there was a guy with a plaid shirt on. And he's standing there with the gun to his head, and just as the trigger was pulled, that's what the picture captured. Well, the guy was in civilian clothes, number one. Number two, he had just killed a tank battalion commander and his entire family, and was carrying a weapon when he was captured by the police chief and his men. So he was summarily executed. Okay? What happened was the police chief actually told one of his underlings, shoot him. Now, I don't leave it there. I go back to the Battle of the Bulge. What happened at the Battle of the Bulge?
Patton.
Well, Patton was after the fact. But what really happened at the Battle of the Bulge that brings this story to fruition was that the Germans mounted this massive attack along the front that was the thinnest defended, and it was defended by American troops, but it was very weakly defended. So they attacked with tanks. They had their top-of-the-line troops. They had SS troops, which are the special forces, very nasty people, and they were a whole brigade of SS were in U.S. military uniforms. They went behind the U.S. lines. They actually captured an artillery unit, marched them into the woods, set up machine guns, and machine gunned the whole crew of Americans. Now, the Americans, they couldn't defend themselves because these were Americans that were automatically taking control of them. 3 of the guys got away, and they were able to sound the alarm. And after Patton came in and the weather cleared and the planes came in and defeated the German attack, they captured a bunch of these German soldiers still in American uniforms. They marched them down the road and they lined them up against the wall and summarily executed them by firing squad. That's the truth, and that's exactly what happened. Same thing, but it didn't play well for the press in the United States because they had a narrative that they wanted to get out. And the narrative was very easy, saying, look, a nasty friend of America's is killing this poor innocent civilian over here. And that's the way it read. Yes?
My understanding, I had a young lady come in Tuesday when I was volunteering here, and she knows the individual that pulled the trigger, executing that person.
Oh, the police chief?
Yeah.
Interesting little side story on that. Did she tell you what happened to him after the fall of Vietnam? He was arrested by the North Vietnamese for war crimes. They put him on trial, and then they exonerated him.
Right. Well,
What does
she
that
said-
tell you? The guy was.
Well, she mentioned that he has a restaurant somewhere in North New Jersey.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting. I'm not sure I would want to go in there and complain about the food. That's interesting. That's an interesting story. Yeah. But the fact that he got off, that the North Vietnamese, who were putting all types of people to death, did not give him the ultimate punishment.
Right,
You know, matter of fact, they let him go.
right.
So, yeah. Any other comments or concerns? Since I totally got off the track on the Coast Guard.
Great, it was great.
You were great.
The North Vietnamese are still doing that today.
Yes.
They're taking, there was one farmer there and he had all his rice paddies growing. Well, they dammed it up. So everything dried up. A South Vietnamese refugee sends me these pictures. Well, here's this guy's farm, his rice paddies, all dried up. Everything's dead. He gets a bright idea. Well, this is a good area for sugarcane. So he sets up a pipe, an irrigation, he plants all this. Well, the North Vietnamese came in with bulldozers and they bulldozed all his stuff down. So they want the farmland. They're treating the South Vietnamese. So I talked to one guy, he can't even go home to his country, the South
Really?
Vietnamese.
Have you been back there yet?
No. There's something inside me says, you oughta, but something says, whoa, wait a while. You know,
I never left.
Yeah.
yeah.
I wanna go back.
I had a friend, he's been back 3 times.
It's not the same.
Yeah.
Coca-Cola, Pepsi, they're all over there.
You know, his second trip, he took his wife with him. And apparently the Cowboys are still there, down in Ho Chi Minh City.
Yeah.
And apparently that really flipped her out. And he had to take her back to the airport, put her on the plane. Then he stayed another week. Yeah. So some people find it cathartic. You know who Tom Bird is? Well, I met Tom Bird at a wedding. We were sitting at the same table. His girlfriend at the time was Sidney Biddle Barrows, Mayflower Madam. And she was best friends with the bride. And so we were sitting there, and Tom and I were the only Vietnam veterans at the table. So we gravitated one another, and, you know, and he was at the Ia Drang Valley, along with Moore. He was in Moore's outfit. And but the thing was that he also did Letters Home from Vietnam, which was the home box of the HBO special, which is very good. I don't know where he got his letters from, and he was also the first one to go back to North Vietnam, and he did a documentary back in the late 70s. Interesting guy. Any other questions or comments? Anyway, thank you for listening to me. I'm sorry I diverted from my.
Oh, thank you so
From
much.
my-
and
Thanks for the information, you really helped.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you for your service.
Oh,